Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tailies, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Here, the world slows down for a while. The rain falls softly outside, and we listen to the small moments that often go unnoticed. Memories, letters, thoughts, and dreams. Each story you'll hear tonight is meant to bring calm to your mind and warmth to your heart. So find a cozy spot, let the rain keep you company, and allow your thoughts to drift with the sound. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Rain was falling softly against the window, each drop tracing a slow silver path down the glass. The lamp beside him hummed faintly, casting a pool of amber light over the small wooden table where a half-empty cup of tea had gone cold. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and old paper. Outside, the night was blurred, misty, dim, and infinite. He had been sitting there for hours, listening to the rhythm of the rain, feeling how it filled every corner of the silence that used to belong to her voice. He hadn't planned to think of her tonight, but rain always had a way of bringing her back. It was raining the day she left, and it was raining the day they buried her. Years had gone by since then. Quiet years, busy years, years that folded upon themselves. But somehow, every storm carried the same echo of her laughter fading between raindrops. He reached for the small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. A folded photograph, a ticket stub, a tiny dried flower pressed between pages of an old book. And at the bottom, wrapped in fragile tissue, was the letter he never sent. The paper had yellowed, the edges curled slightly, but her name, written in his careful hand, was still there. He traced it slowly with his thumb, feeling the small tremor beneath his skin. It was strange how the body remembered grief, even after the heart had learned to breathe again. He poured another cup of tea, but the steam rose and vanished before he could sit. The house was too still, the night too long. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, like the sky turning in its sleep. He stood up, looking out at the rain-washed street beyond the glass. The old path that led down to the cemetery would be muddy now, the trees heavy with water, the air full of that soft electric hum before a storm deepens. He thought of her grave, how the grass might have grown wild around it, how the stone might be slick and dark with moss. He had avoided that place for too long. Each year he told himself he would go, and each year he didn't. There was always something in the way. Work, time, fear, the ache of remembering too clearly. But tonight, the pull was quiet and certain, like the rain itself calling him back. He took his coat from the rack, its collar still smelling faintly of smoke and rain from winters long past. He slipped the letter into the inside pocket, where it rested against his chest. The clock on the wall ticked once, then seemed to pause. When he opened the door, the sound of the rain wrapped around him, soft, endless, almost kind. The wind brushed his hair, carrying that damp scent of earth and leaves that only came when the world was clean again. He stepped into it, the cold, immediately sinking through his shoes, but he didn't turn back. The road stretched ahead, pale beneath the occasional flicker of lightning. Each step splashed lightly, marking his return to something he thought he'd left behind. Somewhere beyond the trees, the cemetery waited, quiet, soaked in thunderlight. He closed his umbrella halfway, letting some of the rain touch his face. It felt almost like forgiveness. Somewhere, he thought, she might be smiling, not because he came too late, but because he came at all dot, and so, with the sound of distant thunder rolling gently above the rooftops, he began his walk toward her. The rain softened as he walked, though the sky still murmured above, a low, constant growl rolling between clouds. The streetlights flickered in thin halos, their glow rippling across puddles like fragile moons. He knew this road by heart, or at least he used to. It was the same road they had once walked together after school, shoes soaked, her laughter bright against the rhythm of falling rain. Now it was quieter, lonelier. The houses looked older, their windows drawn like tired eyes. He held the umbrella. In one hand, though most of the rain had already found him, his coat clung to his shoulders, the fabric darkened by water. But he didn't mind. There was something strangely comforting about being drenched. As if the rain could wash away the years he had tried to forget God at the corner, he passed the old bookstore, boarded up now, its windows clouded with dust and ivy. Once, they had hidden there from a storm much like this one. She had picked up a worn copy of Wuthering Heights and told him that some stories were only meant to be half finished, like love caught between two seasons. He hadn't understood then. He did now. The rain thickened for a moment, then slowed again. He could smell wet leaves, hear the soft rush of water along the gutters, and far away, the faint toll of a church bell marking the hour. It must be close to midnight. The town slept. Only the rain was awake. He crossed the small bridge that curved over the stream. The wood creaked under his steps, slick with moss. Beneath him, the water moved lazily, carrying fallen petals and bits of old leaves. For a second, he paused, watching how the ripples glowed under the flash of lightning, each one expanding, breaking, reforming. It reminded him of memory, how it never truly disappeared, only changed shape over time, that the path beyond the bridge led through a row of tall acacia trees. Their branches leaned together overhead, forming a dark, dripping tunnel. When the wind passed through, raindrops fell like tiny beads onto his shoulders, onto the umbrella, onto the earth. He remembered how she used to tilt her face up to feel them, saying that rain was the only thing that never lied. It fell the same on every one dot as he walked. He noticed the world seemed smaller, quieter than it used to. The street signs were rusted, the bench they once sat on gone. Even the little bakery that used to fill the air with the smell of sweet bread had been replaced by a locked metal gate. Time had folded everything inward, keeping only the faint outlines of what used to be. He wondered what she would look like now, if she had lived. Would she still tuck her hair behind her ear when she laughed? Would her hands still smell faintly of lavender and rain? These thoughts came softly, without pain, only the tender ache of distance. The rain began again, steady and even. He adjusted his umbrella and quickened his pace. Ahead, the road curved slightly to the left, and there, through the fog and trees, he could see the faint glow of the cemetery gate. The metal shimmered with moisture, vines crawling up its sides. Beyond it, rows of headstones glistened under the silver wash of the storm. He stopped for a moment, letting the sight settle in him. The last time he stood there, his hands had been shaking. He had not cried, not then, not even when the first handful of soil hit the coffin lid. He remembered how he wanted to, but something inside had frozen, refusing to let grief spill out. He had simply stood, numb, as rain mixed with the tears of others that now, years later, the gate stood the same. Only he had changed. He took a deep breath. The rain cooled his face, and he felt suddenly lighter, like something was about to lift. He placed his hand on the cold iron handle and pushed it open. It creaked softly, a sound both welcoming and mournful dot inside. The air smelled of wet grass and memory. The path ahead wound between stone markers, each one carrying a name, a story, a silence. Somewhere in that quiet garden of the past, she was waiting, not in body, but in the shape the rain made when it fell. He closed his umbrella and let the rain fall freely on his hair, his shoulders, his hands. The thunder rolled again, gentle this time, as if the sky itself was whispering approval. He stepped forward. The mud clung to his shoes. The leaves brushed against his coat. With every step, the years between them began to fade, not gone, but softened. Somewhere near the heart of the cemetery, beneath a willow that bent low with sorrow, her grave awaited Dot, and tonight he was finally walking home. The cemetery was a landscape of shadows and whispers. Rain fell gently now, like 1,000 soft fingertips brushing across stone and grass. Each droplet made a sound, faint, delicate, echoing between the tilted markers. His shoes sank slightly into the damp earth as he followed the winding path that glimmered under flashes of distant lightning. The air carried the faint scent of wet roses, mingling with moss and soil. He remembered bringing her flowers once, pale ones, the color of clouds before dawn. He couldn't recall what kind, only that she had laughed, saying he always chose the quietest colors. "You love things that whisper," she had told him. He smiled now, a small, tired curve of the lips. She had been right. He reached the old oak tree near the edge of the grounds, its roots thick and exposed like veins of time. From there, he could see the small path leading down to the willow grove. The gate behind him creaked again in the wind, a reminder of how alone he was in this hour. Yet it wasn't a lonely feeling, not entirely. There was something companionable in the company of the rain and the stone's Dot as he walked deeper. The thunder above rolled slowly, its growl softened by distance. The flashes of light illuminated rows of names, each one momentarily alive before returning to darkness. He thought about how fragile memory was, how quickly a name could fade when no one spoke it aloud. He stopped beneath the willow. Its branches hung low, heavy with rain, swaying gently in the breeze. The air here was cooler, quieter, as if the world had drawn a curtain between this place and everything beyond. Drops of water slid down his face, uncertain whether they were rain or tears. He took a moment before moving closer. The last time he stood here, everything had been too bright, the umbrellas black and glistening, the priest's voice trembling over the storm. He had watched the ground swallow her name and couldn't bear to come back after that Dot now. Years later, the grave seemed almost peaceful. The grass had grown in thick and soft. The stone itself was streaked with green, its edges warm. But her name was still clear, carved deep enough to resist both weather and time. He knelt, tracing the letters slowly, his fingertips following each curve as though they were fragile veins of memory. The chill of the stone seeped into his skin. "Hello," he whispered Dot. It was strange how easily the word came, as if no time had passed at all. He felt foolish for saying it, yet also relieved. For years, every thought he had of her stayed inside him, turning over and over like a stone in water. Now, the words finally had somewhere to land. He let his hand rest on the grave. The rain fell harder for a moment, tapping gently on the umbrella, on the leaves on his shoulders. Somewhere above, a streak of lightning painted the sky, and for an instant, everything was illuminated. The willow, the stone, the faint mist curling around the earth. He closed his eyes. The thunder followed, deep and distant, like a slow heartbeat. He could almost imagine her standing behind him, smiling, her hair damp with rain. Not the way she looked at the end, pale and tired, but the way she was when they were young, when every day seemed to have a little light hidden in it. The memories came like soft waves, her voice calling his name, the sound of her shoes on wet pavement, the way she would hum a tune when she thought no one was listening. He didn't fight them this time. He let them come. "Do you remember?" he whispered. "How we used to count the seconds between thunder and lightning?" His voice trembled slightly. "You always said if the gap was long enough, the storm would pass. But it never really did it?" A small smile crossed his face, though his eyes burned. "Maybe that's all right," he added quietly. "Maybe some storms aren't meant to end." He looked around, realizing how still the world had become. The rain had slowed again to a fine mist, floating more than falling. The willow's branches swayed gently above him, their leaves glistening like threads of silver. Somewhere nearby, a small stone bird perched on another grave. Its wings slick with rain. He felt an odd peace in that moment, a sense that the air itself was listening. Holding everything he could not say, he brushed a few fallen petals from the base of the stone and set them aside carefully. His knees ached, but he stayed where he was, unwilling to move yet. There was still more to tell her, more to release into the rain. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the folded envelope, soft, warm, waiting. But not yet. Not until the sky quieted a little more. For now, he simply knelt there, beside the name he had not spoken in years, while thunder rolled far away, like a lullaby for the living and the gone. He stayed beneath the willow until the thunder faded into a gentle hum. The grave before him was dark with rain, the engraved letters glistening like ink still wet. He ran his fingers over her name again, Clara Bennett. The syllables felt both foreign and familiar, like a language he used to speak fluently, but had long forgotten. The ground around him was carpeted with wet leaves. Some had gathered in the shallow groove at the base of the stone, swirling slowly in tiny circles as rain trickled past. He brushed them away carefully, his movements instinctive, tender, as though tidying her room one last time. A droplet slid down from the willow above, landing on the back of his hand. It lingered there for a heartbeat, trembling before slipping down his wrist and disappearing into his sleeve. He thought of the last time he had seen her, the way her fingers had been cold in his, the way her eyes had fluttered like someone waking from a long dream. He hadn't said enough then. Maybe no one ever did. He sat back, resting his palms on the damp grass. The rain had become a fine mist now, falling so lightly it felt more like breath than water. The air was thick with that clean scent that comes only when the world has cried itself empty. "Do you know," he whispered, "they replaced the bench by the river?" His voice wavered, but kept going, almost conversational. "It's made of metal now. The old wooden one, the one you loved, it finally gave up after all those winters." He smiled faintly, watching a small puddle ripple beside him. "I still walk there sometimes. Not often, but sometimes." It felt strange, talking aloud like this, but also strangely right. The words came in small pieces, like scattered feathers drifting through rain. He told her about the years that had passed, about the small apartment he'd moved into, the job that had kept him too busy to think, the way the world had grown quieter, but not necessarily kinder. He told her how some nights, when thunder echoed over the rooftops, he'd wake and imagine hearing her laugh again, that bright, unguarded sound that once filled entire rooms. "I used to be afraid of forgetting," he said softly. "But I think maybe forgetting isn't something that happens all at once. It's more like snow, falling bit by bit until the shape beneath it becomes something new." He took a long breath. The air tasted like rain and stone. He reached for the inside pocket of his coat, and for the first time that night, pulled out the letter dot. It was wrapped in old, fragile paper, yellow, edges frayed, but still whole. He held it between both hands, feeling its weight, its warmth against his palms. It was strange how something so small could hold so much time inside it. He brushed off a stray drop of rain and traced the faded ink, where her name was written in his handwriting. For Clara, he hadn't planned to read it tonight. For years, the letter had been enough just to carry, folded, silent, tucked close to his heart. But now here, with her name before him and the rain falling softly, he knew he couldn't keep it sealed any longer. He looked around. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the willow's branches stilled, the air pausing in quiet anticipation. He unfolded the paper carefully, the creases crackling like old whispers. Not the first line was smudged, but still legible. You once said the rain always finds its way home. Maybe that's why I think of you every time it falls." He stopped, a lump forming in his throat. He could remember writing that, sitting by the same window he sat by tonight, her laughter echoing faintly in the next room. Unaware that time was already slipping away from them, he read the next line under his breath. "I wanted to tell you that some days I feel like I'm standing in two places, one where you still exist, and one where you don't." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He swallowed hard, blinked, and let the next words escape on an exhale dot. "If the rain reaches you, I hope it carries a little of me with it, the part that never learned to say goodbye." He folded the letter again and set it gently against the stone. A drop of rain hit the paper, spreading the ink just slightly, enough to make it look alive. He sat there for a long time, saying nothing. The wind rustled through the willow, soft and low, as if repeating the words he could no longer speak. "Do you hear me?" he asked finally. His voice was small. "I came back." No answer came, but he didn't need one. The quiet itself felt like an embrace, a stillness that didn't demand, only understood Dot, and when lightning flashed again, the reflection of her name shone bright for an instant before melting back into the dark. As if she had smiled, and then gone to rest again, he didn't move for a while. The rain came and went in quiet waves, like breath passing through the world. Around him, the cemetery was a sea of murmuring leaves and whetstone, each grave holding a silence deeper than words. He stared at the letter resting on her grave, the envelope soaked through now, the ink spreading into delicate blue veins across the page dot. It didn't matter. The letter had been written for this moment, not to be read, but to return. He had carried it long enough. It had followed him through every season, folded neatly beside his heart, its weight both comfort and ache. Now, watching it darken under the rain, he felt something inside him unclench Dot. He thought of the day he wrote it, sitting by his window. The rain falling just like this, trying to find the right words for everything left unsaid. It had been her birthday then. He had bought her a gift, something small and foolish, a silver bookmark shaped like a feather. He had planned to visit, but work kept him late, and he told himself there would be another day. There wasn't. He exhaled slowly, feeling the heaviness of those years loosen with every drop that fell. Maybe regret was never meant to disappear, only to soften, the way paper does when touched by water. Dot. He reached down and brushed a few petals from the letter. "You always said I should write more," he murmured, smiling faintly. "Well, I did. I just never sent them." In the distance, the thunder returned, not sharp, but low and far away, like a voice speaking from another room. The sound reminded him of the evenings they used to spend by her porch, watching storms roll across the horizon. She loved lightning, called it the sky remembering itself. He looked up now, following the faint silver threads that streaked across the clouds. The rain glowed against them, soft and endless. When he lowered his gaze again, he saw movement near the far side of the path, a small figure carrying a lantern. An old man, bent slightly, wearing a long coat that brushed against the wet grass. The caretaker, he guessed. The man walked slowly, pausing now and then to check the candles placed before other graves. The flame inside his lantern flickered like a pulse. When the caretaker reached him, he nodded kindly, his voice calm and unhurried. "Late night to visit," he said. "Yes," he replied softly. "It's been a long time." The old man smiled faintly. "The rain brings back the ones we miss," he said, as if it were the simplest truth. Then he looked down at the letter on the grave. "You must have loved her deeply." He hesitated. "I did," he said at last, "just not soon enough." The caretaker's eyes were gentle, the kind of eyes that had seen many storms, and many people standing exactly where he stood now. Love doesn't worry about time, he said. It just stays, sometimes quiet, sometimes stubborn, but it stays. He nodded, unable to answer. The old man touched the brim of his hat, wished him a good night, and moved on down the path, his lantern swaying softly like a moving star among the graves. When the light disappeared, the rain seemed louder for a moment. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill him. It wasn't sorrow anymore, not exactly. It was something quieter, more like release. He leaned back against the willow trunk. The bark was rough and wet beneath his palm. He could feel the slow rhythm of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt to breathe. He whispered her name again, not to summon her, but to return it to the air, to let it belong to the rain, the night, the world that had carried them both this far. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, faint, hesitant, as though they too were half asleep. Midnight, he thought. A new day beginning, one she would never see, and yet somehow still part of. He smiled at that thought, at the strange comfort it carried. Maybe love wasn't meant to end with the body. Maybe it simply changed shape, the way rain turned to mist, mist to cloud, cloud back to rain again. He rose slowly, knees stiff, brushing off the mud clinging to his coat. The letter was almost gone now, its ink fading into the stone. He didn't pick it up. Some things weren't meant to be saved. Instead, he placed his hand on the grave one last time. The stone was cold, but not unkind. "Thank you," he whispered, for waiting. As he turned to leave, the rain began to fall again, soft and even, not mournful, not heavy, just steady. It followed him as he walked back up the path. A companion, a promise, behind him beneath the willow. The letter slowly melted into the earth dot by the time he reached the edge of the willow grove. The rain had settled into a quiet drizzle. The air shimmered faintly with mist, wrapping everything in a soft silver haze. He paused under a lantern fixed to one of the iron posts, its light weak but warm, catching the fine spray that floated through the night. The road back seemed longer than before, stretched by memory. He turned once more toward her grave, just visible through the curtain of rain. The willow's branches swayed gently, brushing the air in slow rhythm, as if waving goodbye. He stood there until the shapes blurred, until her resting place became only a darker patch in the field of gray. Then he started walking again. The path wound through a narrow corridor of trees, their leaves dripping steadily. The smell of wet bark and distant lilacs filled the air. He remembered how she used to stop mid-walk, close her eyes, and breathe in deeply after rain, saying, "That's the smell of beginning again." He had always laughed at her for that, teasing that she romanticized everything. Now, all these years later, he finally understood what she meant. He walked slower as the memories grew clearer. The last spring they had together came back in small flashes. The morning light through the curtains, her handwriting on a half-finished postcard, the way her laughter softened whenever she was tired. He used to think memory was cruel, but now he saw it differently. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a bridge, fragile, trembling, but still there. When the rain thickened again, he opened his umbrella. The drops made a steady tapping sound overhead, the same rhythm that had once filled the pauses between their conversations. He thought of all the words they'd left unsaid, all the quiet moments that had once seemed ordinary, but now felt sacred. Lightning flickered far off beyond the hills, followed by a rumble so low it felt like the ground itself sighing. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up and let the brief light wash over him, brightening the path ahead, revealing puddles that mirrored the sky. Each one held a reflection of the lanterns, trembling slightly with every ripple of rain. He stopped beside one, and crouched down, watching his reflection shimmer in the water. Older, more lined, but somehow lighter. It struck him that grief had shaped him quietly, like a river carving stone. It hadn't broken him. It had simply changed his edges. He picked up a small branch that had fallen nearby and drew a simple line through the puddle. The reflection split and came together again when the ripples faded. "See?" he whispered, half smiling. "It always returns." He kept walking, past the old fence, past the crooked sign that read Hillview Cemetery. The night air grew softer, carrying the faint hum of the town below. A car engine somewhere distant. A dog barking once, the whisper of rain on rooftops dot when he reached the main road. He stopped under a streetlight and looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from release. He took a slow, deep breath. The rain gathered along the brim of his umbrella, dripping in tiny streams that sparkled before hitting the ground. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to hurry home. There was no urgency, no ache pressing behind his ribs, just the quiet rhythm of footsteps and rain. He thought of the letter dissolving into the soil, the ink bleeding into the earth above her name. Maybe that was how love continued, not as a story retold, but as something small that seeps into the ground and feeds the living. He looked up again at the sky, clouds moving like slow breaths across the moon's pale face. "Good night," he murmured, unsure if he was speaking to her or to the rain itself. Maybe both got as he walked. He passed the old bridge again. The water below gleamed faintly, carrying fallen petals and bits of leaves toward the river. He leaned over the rail, watching how the current twisted and rejoined itself, smooth and inevitable. It reminded him of her handwriting, flowing, looping, continuous. He stayed there a while, listening to the rain on the river, the wind threading through the trees. Everything around him seemed alive in its stillness. He smiled quietly, a small, tired smile, the kind that comes not from happiness, but from peace. The thunder rolled once more, but now it sounded softer, not like an ending, but like a song winding down. He turned away from the bridge and began the slow walk back toward town, the light from the lanterns flickering across his path. The world smelled clean again, the kind of clean that comes only after something has been forgiven. And somewhere behind him, in the graveyard beneath the willow, the rain continued to fall, gentle, unhurried, washing away the last traces of ink until all that remained was silence and soft earth. The road curved gently downhill, leading him toward the sleeping town. The mist clung low, folding the world into shades of silver and blue. His umbrella trembled lightly in his hand, the fabric fluttering whenever the wind passed. It wasn't a cold night, not really. The kind of warmth that lingers after a storm still hung in the air. The smell of rain-soaked soil, iron, and grass felt strangely alive, like the earth itself was breathing again. He could see the faint glow of his neighborhood, far ahead, small windows flickering in the fog, the distant hum of life returning after the storm. But before he left the hill, he turned once more to look back. The cemetery lay hidden now, behind a curtain of rain and branches, but he could still sense it, that stillness, that fragile peace. It no longer felt heavy. It simply was. He thought about the years between then and now, how much he had carried in silence. There had been good days, even laughter, but always with an invisible thread tugging him backward. He had told himself he'd moved on, but grief had its own quiet way of waiting, not to punish, but to remind. He walked slower as the road flattened out, the soles of his shoes squelching softly with each step. Puddles mirrored the sky in dim reflections, clouds drifting lazily across the surface like unspoken thoughts. He passed the old field where they used to sit and skip stones into the river. It was overgrown now, wildflowers bending under the rain, but he could almost see her there, her dress damp, her hair stuck to her cheek. The way she would laugh when the stone didn't skip at all, but sank immediately. He smiled, shaking his head at the memory. "You never let me win," he murmured. His voice broke the stillness for just a moment, and dissolved back into the rhythm of falling rain. When he reached the wooden fence that bordered the field, he stopped and leaned against it, closing his eyes. He could still hear her voice sometimes, not clearly, but like the echo of something familiar carried by wind. He didn't try to chase it anymore. He let it come and go as it pleased, like the tide. He realized then how much of her still lived in the small things, the smell of wet lilacs, the sound of thunder in the distance, the taste of tea left too long to cool. He didn't need to hold on to the pain to keep her close. She had never been gone from the world, not entirely. She had simply changed form, from presence to memory, from laughter to rain. A flicker of light caught his eye, the street lamp near his house, faint through the fog. It made him think of the first night she visited his old apartment. They had stood by the window, watching a storm just like this one. She had said, "If you ever lose me, find me in the rain." He hadn't understood how literal that promise would become. He reached the edge of town as the drizzle began to fade. The sound of his footsteps changed, from soft earth to the wet click of pavement. Storefronts lined the street, their shutters drawn, rainwater trickling down the gutters. The air smelled faintly of coffee and wet paper, the scent of a town, half asleep after weathering something together. He passed a bakery, its window fogged with steam from inside. For a brief moment, he imagined her there, sitting by the window, hands wrapped around a cup, smiling the way she used to when he arrived late. The image was so vivid it almost hurt, but he didn't look away. He let it stay for a few breaths, then watched it fade gently, like mist dispersing under morning light dot at the end of the street. He paused again. The sky above was soft gray now, lighter toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, dawn was beginning to stretch its fingers through the clouds. The storm had passed. He took off his hat, letting the rain cool his hair one last time. He felt calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from forgetting, but from finally forgiving. He whispered her name once more, but this time it wasn't a call or a prayer. It was simply a word of thanks, carried softly into the thinning air. He began walking again, his shadow stretching faintly in the pale glow of the street lamps. He felt the letter's absence in his pocket, a space once heavy now light. Each step felt new, like beginning again after a long pause. The thunder had stopped completely. The only sound left was the faint patter of the last few raindrops slipping from rooftops, like a clock winding down after a song. He smiled to himself. Maybe love didn't end when people did. Maybe it simply learned to walk beside the living, invisible, patient, and kind dot, and somewhere behind him, under the willow, the soil held the ink of his words. The rain cradling it gently, not erasing, not preserving, just letting it rest dot by the time he reached his street. The rain had quieted to a whisper. Water still dripped from the eaves in slow, steady drops, each one falling into small puddles that shimmered under the dim porch lights. The air smelled of wet wood and something faintly sweet, maybe jasmine, maybe the remnants of someone's evening tea carried through an open window. He walked slower now, his shoes leaving dark prints on the pavement. Everything felt softer, the world, the night, even his own thoughts. The heaviness that had lived in his chest for years was loosening, replaced by a quiet ache that felt almost tender. Grief, he realized, was not something to outgrow. It was something to move beside, like rain beyond the window. Always there, but no longer drowning dot, his house came into view. A small cottage at the end of the lane, half hidden by a cherry tree. The windows were fogged, golden light spilling faintly from within. It looked exactly as he had left it, yet somehow different, as though he had been away for years instead of hours. When he opened the gate, the hinges creaked, and he smiled at the familiar sound. He paused under the porch, shaking the rain from his umbrella. Droplets slid down and caught the light, turning to small stars before they disappeared. Inside, the house welcomed him with warmth. The faint scent of pine and paper, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the way the lamplight stretched across the wooden floor like an old friend waiting. He hung his coat by the door and stood there for a moment, breathing. It was the same silence as before, but it no longer felt empty. He crossed to the window and looked out. The rain had almost stopped, only a few threads still falling across the glass. The reflection of the room merged with the faint outline of the world outside, light and shadow, blending until he could no longer tell which belonged to which. On the table, the teacup still waited, half full, its surface cooled to stillness. He picked it up and took a sip. The taste was flat, but he didn't mind. It felt right, like closing a circle. He placed the cup down and reached for the small wooden box again, the one that had held her letter. It was nearly empty now. Just the photograph, the dried flower, the ticket stub. He lifted the photo gently, holding it near the lamplight. It showed her sitting by the riverbank, hair loose, smiling toward the camera with sunlight on her face. Behind her, the water shimmered, catching the glow of that long-ago afternoon. He hadn't noticed it before, but the background of the photo, the trees, the slant of the light, looked strangely like the cemetery path tonight, softened by mist. He traced the outline of her face with his fingertip. The paper was cool, smooth, alive in its own quiet way. He placed the photo beside the cup, then leaned against the window frame. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly again, not a warning, just a reminder that the sky was still awake. The sound rolled across the hills, long and deep, until it faded into the steady hush of rainfall. He closed his eyes and listened. It wasn't sorrow that filled him now, but a gentle warmth, like the soft weight of a blanket. For years, he had feared that visiting her grave would reopen something he couldn't bear to feel again. But it hadn't. Instead, it had given him back the part of himself he thought he'd buried with her. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on the umbrella leaning by the door, its handle still damp, its fabric darkened by rain. He smiled. Maybe he would leave it by her grave next time. She had always loved umbrellas, called them tiny shelters in an unkind world. He took a slow breath. The room felt different now, fuller somehow. The rain on the window was steady again, but softer, like a lullaby the world had been waiting to sing. He sat down in the armchair, the old one she used to tease him for keeping, and let his body sink into the cushions. His clothes were still damp, but he didn't care. He let his eyes wander to the window again, where reflections of lamplight and raindrops danced together like fragments of a fading dream. He whispered, almost to himself, "I think I can sleep tonight." The clock ticked. The lamp hummed. The rain whispered against the glass, and somewhere far beyond the edge of sound, beyond the quiet, beyond the years, he thought he could hear her humming too. He woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. The rain had quieted to a mist, the kind that blurs the line between air and water. The world outside looked washed, rooftops glistening, leaves jeweled with dew, the street empty except for the faint shimmer of puddles. The storm had left everything cleaner, gentler, as if the night had pressed a cool hand over the town and told it to rest. He sat up slowly, the blanket slipping down his shoulder. The room smelled faintly of tea and damp wool. His body ached pleasantly, the kind of ache that comes not from weariness, but from release. On the table by the window, the photograph still lay where he'd left it, the lamplight from last night now replaced by pale morning gold. He looked at it for a long time. Something inside him had shifted. The emptiness was still there, but it no longer hurt. It had changed shape into a quiet space where her memory could sit without demanding anything. For the first time in years, the thought of her didn't pull him backward. It simply existed, soft as breath. He rose and went to the window. The sky was a muted gray, the kind that promised a gentle day. He unlatched the window and pushed it open. Cool air brushed his face, bringing with it the scent of wet grass and rain-soaked wood. A few birds were already stirring in the trees, their songs hesitant, like voices warming up after sleep. He leaned his elbows on the sill, eyes half closed, listening. The steady drip of rain from the eaves marked time like a heartbeat. Somewhere far off, he could hear a car starting, a door closing, the small murmurs of life beginning again. He thought of the cemetery, the willow, the letter dissolving into the soil. He wondered if the ink had completely washed away by now, or if some trace of it still lingered, faint blue threads sinking slowly into the earth. He liked to think that even if the words disappeared, the intention remained, absorbed into the roots, the grass, the air above her resting place. He reached for the teapot and poured what was left of yesterday's tea into a cup. It was cold, but he drank it anyway. The bitterness felt grounding, a reminder of the ordinary world he had almost forgotten how to love. After breakfast, he put on his coat again, though the sky had already begun to clear. He stepped outside and stood on the porch for a long while, watching steam rise faintly from the wet ground. The cherry tree beside his house dripped softly, the petals pale and heavy with moisture. One detached, fluttering down to land near his shoe. He bent to pick it up, fragile, almost translucent between his fingers. He smiled and tucked it into his coat pocket. The street was quiet. Across the way, an elderly woman was sweeping water from her doorstep, humming under her breath. She looked up and waved. He waved back. It was such a small exchange, but it felt like the start of something, a reconnection with the living. Perhaps. He walked a little further down the lane, stopping by the postbox at the corner. Its red paint was chipped, glistening faintly in the morning light. He reached into his coat, half out of habit, expecting to feel the folded letter that had lived there for so long. But his fingers met only the smooth fabric lining. Empty. For a moment, he stood there uncertain. Then, slowly, he smiled. "It's all right," he murmured. "It's where it should be." He continued walking, past the cafe just opening its doors, the smell of fresh bread drifting out. Past the bookshop, its windows fogged with the breath of a new day. Everywhere, life moved quietly forward. He paused outside the flower shop on the corner. The window display was full of color. Tulips, lily, irises, all gleaming under drops of water. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The shopkeeper, a woman with kind eyes, greeted him softly. "Still raining out there?" "A little," he said, brushing his coat sleeve. "But it's a good kind of rain." She smiled. "Always is." He looked over the flowers, not knowing what he wanted until he saw them. Small white ones, delicate and shy. The same kind he thought he had once brought her years ago. He picked up a handful. "Just these," he said. "Lovely choice," the woman replied, wrapping them carefully in brown paper. He took the bouquet and stepped back out into the mist. The air felt lighter now, the sky brightening. He didn't know if he would go back to the cemetery today. Maybe not yet. But he liked the thought that the flowers would find their way there soon, even if only in spirit dot. As he walked home, he looked down at the blooms in his hand. Tiny drops of rain clung to the petals, trembling slightly with every step. He thought of her, not as she was at the end, but as she had always been, laughing under an umbrella, eyes bright with something like joy. He whispered, almost smiling, "You were right. Clara." the rain does find its way home. The rest of the morning passed quietly. The clouds began to break, revealing faint ribbons of blue, and sunlight spilled across the wet pavement in thin, golden threads. The whole town seemed to exhale, steam rising from rooftops and cobblestones, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath all night. He placed the bouquet of white flowers in a small vase by the window. The petals caught the light, trembling softly in the breeze that drifted through the open frame. From where he sat, he could see the rain sliding gently from the leaves of the cherry tree, each drop catching a spark of sunlight before falling into the soil below Dot. He sipped his tea, fresh this time, warm, fragrant. The taste filled his mouth like memory, soft and familiar. On the table lay the photo of Clara, still framed in that quiet smile. He tilted it slightly so the morning light touched her face, and for a moment she looked alive again, not in the way of ghosts, but in the way love lingers in small things. He reached for a pen and an empty sheet of paper. For a while, he just sat there, listening to the faint ticking of the clock, unsure where to begin. Then, almost without thinking, he started to write Dot, "It's raining again, but softly this time. The kind of rain that doesn't hide the sun." The words came slowly at first, then more easily, like a quiet stream finding its rhythm. He didn't write to her this time, not exactly. He wrote to the rain, to the years, to the part of himself that had waited too long to speak. He wrote about the cemetery, the willow, the way the thunder sounded like forgiveness. He wrote about silence and how it can heal if you let it. When he finished, he folded the paper and set it aside. He didn't plan to send it anywhere. It wasn't a letter meant to travel, only one meant to exist. He leaned back in his chair and let his eyes drift shut. The warmth of the tea, the hum of the day, the soft breeze carrying the faint scent of flowers, it all wrapped around him in a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. Through the open window came the sound of children laughing somewhere down the street, their voices light and distant. A ball bounced once, twice, then rolled into view before being chased away again. He smiled faintly. Life, he thought, had an incredible way of continuing, no matter how many endings it carried. He looked again at the flowers by the window. One petal had fallen, resting on the table beside the cup. He didn't move it. It looked right there, like a punctuation mark at the end of something quietly understood. The afternoon light deepened, turning everything golden. The world outside shimmered, puddles reflecting sky, birds cutting soft arcs across the air. He thought about how many times he had sat here before, looking out at rain, waiting for something that would never come back. But today, the waiting had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was simply presence, a kind of gentle remembering. He whispered her name one last time. It came easily now, unweighted, like the final note of a song that no longer hurts to hear. The clock struck noon, its chime low and round. He took one last sip of tea, then stood and closed the window. The breeze quieted. The sound of the rain faded until it was just a hum beneath the heartbeat of the day. He picked up the letter he had just written and placed it inside the wooden box, beside the photograph and the dried flower. The box was almost full again, not with grief, but with peace. Before closing the lid, he paused and whispered softly, "For the days that still rain." Then he smiled and set it back on the shelf. He turned off the lamp, letting sunlight take over the room. Everything looked brighter now, the kind of brightness that comes not from light alone, but from acceptance. As he stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, but the sky was already clearing. The puddles reflected the clouds as they drifted apart, slow and graceful. He took a deep breath and began walking, not toward the cemetery, but toward the town, toward life. And as he walked, a breeze passed through, carrying the faintest sound of rain still falling somewhere far away. Soft, endless, and kind, the afternoon unfolded slowly, as if time itself had decided to rest. He wandered through the small streets of town, each corner still glistening with leftover rain. The bakery windows fogged again from the warmth inside, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with damp pavement and sunlight. It was such an ordinary smell, but it filled him with quiet gratitude, the kind that makes the simplest moment feel holy. He stopped outside the bookstore next door, the same one that had once been their shelter, years ago when a storm caught them walking home. The sign above the door was new, brighter, but the bones of the place were the same, the crooked shelves visible through the glass, the faint golden light spilling out onto the street. On impulse, he went in. A small bell above the door chimed softly. The air smelled of dust, paper, and rain-soaked coats, a scent that somehow always felt like belonging. There were only a few people inside, a woman browsing near the poetry section, a young man flipping through second-hand novels. He wandered to the back, where an old section of shelves leaned slightly against the wall. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps. He reached out and ran a finger along the spine of a familiar title, Wuthering Heights. He smiled quietly. That book again. The same one she had once held years ago, her laughter echoing through aisles that no longer existed. He took it down and opened it. The pages were soft with age, edges slightly yellow. A faint scent of mildew clung to the paper. Tucked between the pages was a small pressed leaf, perfectly preserved, a remnant from someone else's story. Maybe another pair of hands that had found solace here long before him. He turned a few pages and stopped at a line, underlined in pencil. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. The words sat there, gentle and certain, as if waiting. He read them twice, then closed the book carefully, tracing the worn cover with his thumb. It wasn't sorrow he felt anymore. It was connection, not just to her, but to every person who had ever loved and lost and found a way to keep going. He carried the book to the counter. The shopkeeper, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up with a faint smile. "A good choice," he said. "You like the classics?" He nodded. "It's an old memory." The man wrapped the book carefully in brown paper, then slid it across the counter. "Funny thing about stories," he said. "They never really end. They just wait for the right moment to begin again." He thanked him, left a few coins on the counter, and stepped back out into the light. The clouds were parting completely now, a pale stretch of blue unfurling above the rooftops. The warmth of the wrapped book in his hand felt comforting, like something quietly alive. He walked back toward the river. The water had risen slightly from the night's rain, moving in slow, heavy ripples that caught the afternoon sun. He leaned on the railing, resting the book against his chest. The air smelled of silt and grass, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers newly bent by the storm. He looked down at the water, at the reflections shimmering and reforming with each passing breeze. It reminded him of that night at the cemetery, how he had seen his reflection in a puddle, split and mended by ripples. Now it was the river doing the same, reminding him that everything broken eventually learns how to flow again. He closed his eyes and let the sunlight warm his face. For the first time in so long, his thoughts were still. Not empty, not restless, just still. When he opened his eyes, a young couple was walking hand in hand along the opposite bank. The woman's hair caught the light, glinting gold against the breeze. They laughed about something small, a joke, maybe, or a shared secret. The sound carried faintly across the water. He smiled. It didn't sting anymore to see love like that. It only reminded him that life continued, always finding new forms, new hearts to live in. He turned the book over in his hands and opened it once more. On the inside cover, He wrote a few words in small, careful letters. For whoever finds this next, may you love bravely, lose gently, and always listen when it rains. He slipped the pressed leaf back between the pages, closed it, and placed it on the bench by the river. The wind ruffled the paper wrapping, lifting one corner before letting it settle again. He took one last look at it and began walking home. The sound of the river behind him, steady, forgiving, eternal. And when the first drop of new rain touched his face, he didn't open his umbrella. He let it fall. Evening came gently, as though the world had agreed to speak only in whispers. The light faded slowly over the rooftops, tinting everything in the soft colors between gold and gray. He walked home along the quiet street, the air warm with the scent of wet earth and smoke from a few chimneys already beginning to burn. The storm had left the town washed and calm. Puddles still glimmered in the gutters, birds rustled in the trees, and the low hum of distant conversation drifted from open windows. When he reached his house, he paused before going inside. The cherry tree by the porch was still dripping rain, its blossoms pale against the dusk. He reached up, touched one of the branches, and watched a few drops fall onto his hand. The water was cool, alive. It reminded him of the rain on her grave, a sound of thunder rolling above, as if the sky had been speaking for both of them. He stepped inside, hung his coat, and lit the lamp. The golden glow filled the room, chasing the shadows gently into corners. The small vase of white flowers still stood by the window. Some petals had begun to curl inward, tired from the day, but they still held their quiet beauty. He sat down in the armchair again, the same spot where he had written that letter in the morning. The wooden box rested on the shelf above the table. For a while, he just looked at it, feeling the calm that came with knowing its contents. The photo, the dried flower, the new letter, all part of a story that now felt complete. Outside, the rain returned, not heavy, just enough to make a soft ticking sound on the roof. It came without wind, without thunder, like a memory repeating itself gently so it wouldn't be forgotten. He stood and went to the window. The world was a blur of silver and amber, each streetlight haloed in mist. Across the lane, he could see the silhouettes of neighbors moving behind their curtains, small, ordinary lives unfolding. For so long, he had felt outside of that rhythm, living as if time had stopped the day she was gone. But now, he felt himself stepping back into it, not as the same person, but as someone quietly mended. He thought again of the book he had left by the river. Maybe someone would find it tomorrow. Maybe they would read the words he'd written and smile. Maybe they would never notice the small note at all. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had left something behind, a small kindness, piece of the rain that had healed him. The thunder murmured faintly far away, but it was soft, like a heartbeat fading into a lullaby. He closed his eyes and listened. Each drop on the glass carried a rhythm that felt almost like her humming, low, patient, endless. He remembered the night she told him, "If you listen closely, the rain will tell you what the silence means." Back then, he hadn't understood. He'd thought she meant poetry. Now, he knew she meant peace. He poured himself a small glass of wine, not out of habit, but for ritual. He raised it slightly toward the window, toward the rain, toward wherever she might be now. "To the storms," he said quietly, "and to what they leave behind." He took a slow sip. The taste was deep and warm, spreading through him like light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, matching the rhythm of the rain. He leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and let his eyes drift shut. He didn't dream of her that night. Instead, he dreamed of rain, endless fields of it, falling over rooftops, rivers, willow trees, and the smooth surface of stone. It fell on the living and the gone alike, with no difference, no boundary. Everything was washed in the same quiet mercy. When he woke again, it was still dark, though the first hint of dawn hid behind the horizon. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like a breath held in the chest of the world. He sat up and looked around. The lamp had burned low, the teacup was empty, and outside, the clouds were breaking once more. He felt rested, not because he had slept deeply, but because he had finally laid something down. He went to the window one last time and opened it. The air was cool, sweet, and new. He whispered softly, not expecting an answer. "Sleep well, Clara." The wind moved through the cherry branches, rustling the leaves in response. It wasn't her voice, but it was close enough. He smiled. Then he closed the window gently, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness settle, not as absence, but as rest. Morning came softly again, wrapped in a light fog that settled over the town like a blanket. The storm had left the air cool and bright, carrying that faint sweetness that always follows rain, part grass, part earth, part something you can't quite name. The world seemed to be breathing slower now, as though it too had slept deeply. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, and stood on the porch. The cherry blossoms were opening, their petals trembling slightly whenever a breeze passed. Dew clung to the railing, shining like tiny stars. He rested his palm there, feeling the cool wood beneath his skin. Everything looked so ordinary, and yet nothing felt the same. Across the street, the woman who swept her porch each morning was already outside, humming softly. A cat curled at her feet, flicking its tail against the wet boards. The world was waking up, not loudly, but tenderly. He smiled to himself. It had been so long since he'd noticed mornings like this, the kind that asked for nothing except to be seen. For years, his days had been heavy before they even began. But now, there was space again. The kind of space grief leaves when it loosens its hold. Not empty, but quiet. He took a sip of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air, and thought about the river, the book he'd left there. Maybe someone had already found it. Maybe not. He pictured a stranger sitting on that same bench, unwrapping the brown paper, reading the words he'd written in small, careful letters. He hoped they would understand, not the details of his story, but the feeling that love doesn't vanish. It only changes shape. The thought made him laugh softly. It felt strange, after so many years, to laugh at all. The sound startled a bird from the cherry tree, and it took off, wings slicing through the fog. He turned his gaze upward, following its flight, until it disappeared into the pale morning light. For a moment, he thought of Clara again. Her face, her voice, the way she tilted her head when she listened. But instead of pain, what came was gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you." Just that. And somehow, it felt like enough about the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain-soaked grass and a faint trace of lilac, her favorite. It brushed against his face, soft as a touch. He closed his eyes, letting it pass through him. When he opened them again, sunlight had begun to break through the clouds, spilling in thin gold lines across the rooftops. The puddles on the street caught the light, reflecting small fragments of sky. He stepped down onto the path and began walking without a destination. The sound of his footsteps mixed with the faint dripping of water from branches, the gentle coo of doves hidden somewhere nearby. It was all so quiet, yet it filled the air completely dark as he walked past the garden fence. He noticed something small and bright near the corner, a single white flower growing through the cracks of the pavement. It looked almost like the ones he'd left by her grave. He crouched down, brushed away a few fallen petals around it, and smiled. "Still following me, huh?" he said softly. The wind stirred, rustling the petals as though in reply. He stayed there for a while, crouched on the damp pavement, feeling the warmth of the sun rising behind him. The flower stood steady, fragile but alive, a small, stubborn piece of beauty that had found its way through stone. He reached into his coat pocket and found the cherry, petal he had kept from the day before. It had dried slightly overnight, curling at the edges, but it was still intact. He laid it beside the white flower, a quiet offering, then stood up again. When he straightened, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the gentle sprawl of the hills in the distance. The sky was clearing fast, turning from gray to blue, the kind of blue you could fall into. He walked toward it, hands in his pockets, listening to the soft crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. He didn't need to visit her grave again today. She was everywhere now, in the rain, in the river, in the light pressing through the clouds. The world, he realized, had not taken her away from him. It had simply taught him new ways to find her. He stopped by the bridge once more, leaning against the railing, watching the water drift past. The surface rippled gently, reflecting sunlight in thin, broken ribbons. He stayed until the chill of the air began to fade, until he could feel the warmth return to his fingers. And then, with a small smile and a deep breath, he whispered into the wind, "I'm okay now." The water carried his words away, folding them into its endless current, soft, sure, and infinite. That evening, the sky was clear for the first time in days. The streets glowed faintly with the last trace of sunset, that tender hour when the world forgets whether it's still day or already night. The air was cool, but not cold, the kind of calm that arrives after a storm, when everything has been washed clean. He sat on the porch again, the old armchair creaking softly beneath him. The cup of tea beside him steamed lazily, catching the last amber light. The cherry tree above rustled now and then, scattering a few petals that floated down to rest on his lap. He didn't brush them away. They felt like part of the evening, small, quiet messengers from the world that still remembered her too. He thought about the past few nights, the walk to the cemetery, the letter, the willow, the rain. Each memory unfolded slowly, no longer sharp, no longer demanding to be understood. It was strange how grief softened once you stopped trying to reason with it. He reached for the umbrella leaning against the wall, the same one he had carried that night. Its fabric was still faintly damp at the edges, and when he turned it over, a few drops fell onto the wooden floor. He smiled. Maybe it was time to let this one go too. The thought came naturally, not forced, as if the rain itself had whispered it. He knew he would go back soon, to leave the umbrella by her grave. It wasn't a goodbye, not really. It was just a gesture, a way of saying, "Here, keep this." For all the storms we never shared, the sound of distant thunder rolled faintly from the horizon, not threatening, just enough to remind him that the world was still breathing. He watched as the clouds on the edge of the sky gathered a faint silver glow, their edges lit by the rising moon. The light touched the roofs, the wet branches, and finally, his hands. He took a slow sip of tea and looked out over the street. A couple walked by, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long beneath the streetlights. A child ran ahead of them, laughing as his boots splashed through the puddles. The sound made him laugh softly too. There was something reassuring about it, life always finding its rhythm again. He leaned back, let his eyes close halfway, and listened. The rain hadn't started yet, but he could feel it in the air, that subtle electricity, that soft promise of falling water. It would come soon, and when it did, he would leave the umbrella by the door. Unneeded, a memory drifted to him, one of the last conversations he'd had with Clara. They had been sitting under a small shelter near the river, a storm passing overhead. She had said, "You know what I love most about rain? It doesn't ask permission to fall. It just does. And somehow, everything grows because of it." He had laughed then, teased her for turning everything into poetry. But now, years later, those words came back differently, not as something sentimental, but as truth. He opened his eyes, letting the last light fade. The sky was dark now, but soft. No sharp edges, no stars yet, just a deep velvet gray. He loved that in-between moment, when the day exhales and the night listens. It reminded him of her voice, calm, certain, endlessly kind. The first drop of rain touched the railing, making a tiny sound that echoed louder than it should have. Then another, then a few more. Within seconds, the world was filled again with that familiar rhythm, soft, steady, endless. He smiled. "There you are," he whispered. The air cooled, the scent of rain rising from the earth once more. It filled every corner of the silence, each drop carrying something like forgiveness, like return. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small pebble he had taken from the cemetery path. It was smooth now, dry, warm from his touch. He turned it in his hand, feeling its weight. It was strange how something so small could remind him of so much. He placed it on the porch railing, beside the fallen petals. The rain began to bead on its surface, glimmering like a heartbeat. "I'll see you again," he said quietly, not as a vow, but as certainty. The rain grew steadier, tapping on the roof, the window, the world. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and listened. Each drop was a word, a memory, a pulse. Everything that had been lost returned in sound. He stayed there until the tea went cold, until the moon slipped from behind the clouds, until the night wrapped around him completely. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for anything. He was simply there, alive, at peace and part of the rain. The rain continued through the night, soft and steady, like a lullaby only the world could sing. From his chair on the porch, he watched the droplets shimmer under the faint glow of the streetlight, falling, merging, disappearing, beginning again. Each sound folded into the next, a rhythm that seemed older than memory. He breathed in deeply. The air was cool, rich with the scent of rain and blossoms. It slipped into his lungs like something healing, something earned. The cup of tea beside him had gone cold long ago, but he didn't move. He only sat there, wrapped in the stillness that follows acceptance. When the thunder came again, it wasn't harsh, only a low, distant roll that sounded like a heartbeat deep within the clouds. It reminded him of her laughter, echoing in old corridors, of soft words shared under umbrellas, of all the things that had once felt ordinary and now felt sacred. He whispered, "I remember," not because he feared forgetting, but because remembering had finally become gentle. The cherry tree swayed above him, its branches heavy with rain. Now and then, a few petals drifted down, landing in the puddle near his feet. They floated for a moment before sinking one by one into the water. He watched them go, thinking how much life resembled that, a quiet falling, a soft return. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened as the rain touched everything, roof, wood, leaves, stone. It was everywhere, and in that there was comfort. He thought of the willow in the cemetery, its branches bending the same way now, the rain weaving through its leaves. Somewhere, that old letter had become part of the soil, part of her, part of the earth itself, and he realized he didn't need to visit again to find her. She was in the rain on his porch, in the clouds above his town, in the steady breathing of the world. Every drop that touched his skin was a reminder that love, once felt, never truly leaves. It only changes form, like water, like light, like time. He reached for the umbrella one last time. The fabric was still damp, the handle smooth from years of use. He turned it over in his hands, smiling faintly. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "I'll bring this to you, He didn't mean it as promise or ritual. It was just something that felt right. The clock struck midnight inside the house, soft, unhurried. The sound melted into the rain, indistinguishable after a few seconds. He stood, stretching slowly, feeling the ache of age and the lightness of peace in the same breath. Before stepping inside, he looked out over the quiet street one more time. The world shimmered beneath the rain, reflections of windows, lamps, and sky blending together like watercolor. Somewhere, far beyond the hill, the river must be rising again, carrying pieces of the night toward the sea. He whispered into the wind, almost smiling. Rest well. He left the door slightly open so the sound of rain could follow him in. The house was dim, bathed in the golden hush of the lamp he'd forgotten to turn off. The flowers by the window glowed faintly under its light, their stems bending toward the glass as if listening too. He sat on the edge of his bed, removed his shoes, and felt the cool floor under his feet. The rhythm of the rain filled the room, steady, kind, eternal. He lay down, the sheets cool against his skin, and let the sound wash through him. Sleep came not as escape, but as arrival. He dreamed of her not as she was before she left, but as light, a figure walking through rain, pausing once to smile, then dissolving gently into the mist. When he woke, the storm had passed. Pale light filtered through the curtains, soft and blue. The air was still damp, carrying the faint trace of rain's memory. He lay there for a while, listening to the quiet. It wasn't silence, not really. It was fullness. He sat up, went to the window, and looked outside. The world was shining. Puddles reflected the morning sky, and the cherry blossoms had scattered across the lawn, turning the ground into a soft pink sea. He smiled. The umbrella leaned by the door, waiting. He didn't rush. He would bring it later, when the sun rose a little higher, when the grass dried just enough to walk without slipping. For now, he poured a cup of tea, opened the window, and let the breeze in. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured once more, not as storm, but as memory. And as the light filled the room, he whispered the only words left to say, "I'm home." The rain had stopped, but its music stayed.